Picture the night sky over Tehran. Suddenly, the darkness is just completely torn apart by the screech of warplanes. Plumes of smoke are billowing from the ruins of the Supreme Leader's residence. Now, I want you to cut to Beijing. At that exact moment, China's state-run Xinhua News is rushing to calm everyone down. They urgently report that a countdown has started. In just a few minutes, Ayatollah Khamenei is going to give this televised, unifying speech.
Right. They had this whole broadcast lined up.
Exactly. But that countdown ticked down to absolutely nothing. According to the source we are unpacking today, that broadcast turned into this long, suffocating global joke. Because at the wreckage site, the coldest confirmation was already being pulled from the rubble. Khamenei, the man who held immense power in the Middle East for decades, along with his son and family, were reportedly wiped out in the very first wave of those airstrikes.
It's an incredibly dramatic image to start with, isn't it? And it really sets the stage for everything we're going to explore today. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are thrilled to have you joining us as we analyze what is honestly a profoundly complex geopolitical moment.
Yeah, and today we're focusing entirely on a single, very specific source. It's a recent video transcript from the YouTube channel China Observer.
And before we go any further, it is absolutely crucial that we set some very clear ground rules for you, our listener. This source material contains highly charged political statements. It has severe claims and very specific partisan viewpoints.
Right.
Our job today is not to take a side. We are acting strictly as your impartial guides here. We're here to analyze the claims, report on the narrative, and examine the viewpoints presented in this specific video transcript without endorsing the political rhetoric. Our goal is just to synthesize the information so you can understand the arguments being made and the cause and effect relationships being proposed.
Exactly. For you, someone who we know is keenly interested in macroeconomics, societal shifts, and global power dynamics, this isn't just a story about a localized Middle Eastern airstrike. Our mission today is to explore a much larger, deeper argument made by the China Observer.
And the thesis of their video is essentially that this event, and specifically the staggering failure of billion-dollar military technology, has sent economic, geopolitical, and social shockwaves directly into the heart of Beijing.
According to the transcript, U.S. President Trump, backed by intelligence, and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu quickly and very coldly confirmed Khamenei's death. There were no negotiations, no attempts at capture.
None.
But the narrative points to something deeper. The claim that what truly sent chills down the spines of strategists in Beijing wasn't just losing a regional ally. It was the mechanical, the actual technological reality of how it happened. Let's start with the defense systems. The source makes a huge deal out of the equipment Iran was using. What exactly was supposedly protecting that airspace?
Well, to understand the gravity of the claim, you have to look at what they describe as a billion-dollar blind spot. Iran's airspace was supposed to be, virtually impenetrable. They were relying heavily on this luxury package of highly touted Chinese military technology.
We're talking top-of-the-line stuff.
Exactly. A multi-layered defense network. First, you have the JY-27A and the JYL-1 long-range early warning radars. At global defense exhibitions, these systems have been praised and aggressively marketed as being capable of making any stealth fighter appear clearly on a monitor.
Right, they sell them as stealth killers.
Yeah. And accompanying these radar systems were the HQ-16 and HQ-17AE surface-to-air missile systems. Those were designed to intercept literally anything those radars caught. Finally, they had this low-altitude anti-drone system ominously named the Silent Hunter. On paper, and definitely in the marketing brochures, this is a fortress. It's designed to create a total dome of situational awareness.
And the video notes that just 7 hours before the strike, Iranian accounts were actually on social media bragging about this exact equipment. They were claiming no one could enter their airspace. So how does the transcript explain the total collapse of this multi-layered fortress? Because it seems like the U.S. and Israeli forces didn't just overpower it, they dismantled it in a very specific sequence.
The chronological breakdown in the source is fascinating from a tactical perspective. First, the claim is that the U.S. military didn't even cross the border initially. They sent in EA-18G Growlers.
Those are the electronic warfare planes.
Right, highly specialized electronic warfare aircraft. The transcript says they initiated full-spectrum electronic suppression. So, if you want to use an analogy for you, imagine a high-tech security system with dozens of cameras. The Growlers didn't shoot the cameras. They essentially flooded the entire network with so much static that the security guards looking at the monitors just saw white noise.
Wow.
They turned Beijing's proud, highly marketed radar screens into static-filled 1990s televisions.
And once the system is effectively blinded like that, the physical strike begins. The source outlines that F-22 Raptors, flying along the western border, fired anti-radiation missiles. Now, for our listener, anti-radiation missiles are designed to lock onto and destroy the source of a radar emission. If the radar is transmitting, the missile follows that invisible beam right back to the dish.
Exactly.
But there is a detail in the video that seems particularly damaging to the reputation of this technology. It claims these systems didn't even register an error message before they were destroyed. How significant is that from a military intelligence standpoint?
Oh, it is a catastrophic failure of situational awareness. If a multi-million-dollar early warning system is destroyed before it can even send an automated ping to Central Command saying, hey, I am under attack, the entire command structure is operating in the dark without realizing it. And that blinded state really paved the way for the final devastating blow.
Which brings us to the physical strike on the leadership.
Yeah, right. The narrative shifts to the actual strike. The claim here is that Israel brought in specially modified F-35I stealth fighters. Now, standard F-35s have a somewhat limited range, which usually requires these massive, slow-moving, mid-air refueling tankers to accompany them.
And those tankers act like giant bullseyes on a radar.
Exactly, they're huge targets. But the video states these specific Israeli jets were equipped with custom, self-developed stealth fuel tanks. This extended their combat radius from 1,200 kilometers to 2,200 kilometers.
Which means they could make the round trip entirely on their own, leaving the vulnerable refueling planes safely behind. According to the China Observer, these modified F-35Is entered Tehran like it was no man's land. They flew right through what was supposed to be a complete three-layer Chinese air defense network as if it literally didn't exist. They systematically destroyed the Revolutionary Guard headquarters and Khamenei's underground residence.
Khamenei was crushed in his bunker. The source claims he probably didn't even get a warning siren. So the video frames this as a global, live-streamed, public execution of Beijing's military technology. It wasn't merely a tactical military defeat for Iran.
Why does the source argue this is such a specific disaster for China on the world stage?
Because it exposes the data. For decades, Beijing has bragged about its saturation attack defense capabilities. They've sold this technology globally based on specific performance metrics, paper data. But when that system is pierced like a sieve in a real-world, high-stakes scenario, the illusion just evaporates.
Everyone is watching.
Every military on Earth, from allies to adversaries, watch those defenses fail to detect a massive incoming strike. The argument builds on the idea that China's military export market and the geopolitical leverage that comes with it is built entirely on the perceived reliability of that very technology.
Let's shift the lens slightly, because the transcript argues the implications stretch far beyond just military prestige and they crash right into global economics. For you, tracking global supply chains, you know how sensitive Chinese manufacturing is to energy spikes. The video draws a direct parallel to an event that happened just a month prior, in January, the capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro. How does the author of the video connect these two geographically distinct events to formulate this idea of an economic shockwave hitting Beijing?
The connecting thread is the technology and the commodity. According to the video, Maduro, much like Khamenei, was supposedly protected by Chinese air defense systems. When those systems failed to protect Maduro and he fell, Beijing instantly lost access to 800,000 barrels of cheap oil per day.
That is a massive loss.
It is. China's massive manufacturing sector and its social engines run on immense amounts of energy. They rely heavily on sanctioned, heavily discounted oil from nations like Venezuela and Iran to keep production costs low. So the argument being made here is that within a single month, you have two major anti-US figures neutralized, and China essentially had its two cheapest, most crucial energy lifelines severed simultaneously.
That is a staggering logistical problem. And the source suggests that if the Strait of Hormuz becomes further destabilized because of the power vacuum in Iran, the resulting energy shock to Beijing's economy would be absolutely immeasurable. So we have the technological failure and the economic crisis. Let's look at the diplomatic fallout. The video details Iran's desperate, immediate response to airstrike, which was to hastily launch roughly 200 missiles. But the transcript claims the results were disastrous, with only 35 even managing to waver into Israeli airspace. Where did the other 165 missiles go?
Well, the transcript notes, with a heavy dose of irony, that these remaining missiles relied on fate-guided targeting.
Fate-guided targeting?
Right, because their reconnaissance and guidance systems were either destroyed by the electronic warfare or they were fundamentally flawed to begin with. So they completely missed high-value U.S. targets. Instead, they slammed into civilian facilities across neighboring Arab countries. They hit the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. One drone even set a fire on Dubai's famous Palm Island, reportedly killing a civilian.
And this specific failure leads to what the source views as the shattering of Beijing's diplomatic masterpiece,
Yes.
right? Because just a few years ago, Beijing very publicly boasted about brokering a historic peace and reconciliation agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It was heralded as the dawn of Chinese diplomatic dominance in the Middle East, proving they could bring bitter rivals together. How did these errant missiles undo years of that diplomatic groundwork?
By forcing those Arab nations to actively defend themselves against Iranian tech. When those 165 missiles went off course, Saudi Arabia and Jordan couldn't just sit by. They had to activate their defense grids. By forcing Saudi Arabia to deploy its U.S.-supplied Patriot batteries to shoot down Iranian missiles, the strike practically forced Saudi Arabia to coordinate with U.S.-Israeli defense grids in real time.
That is incredible.
The insight here is that Beijing tried to build a diplomatic bridge on a foundation of military sand. When the military tech failed and Iran's weapons threatened Arab civilians, that diplomatic bridge collapsed. Saudi Arabia and Jordan essentially allied themselves with the U.S.-Israeli coalition to protect their airspace. The diplomatic victory Beijing had spent years cultivating dissolved overnight. It was replaced by active military coordination with Beijing's rivals.
The source even mentions that Beijing had been eagerly preparing to sign a major defense agreement with Tehran. But after this strike, that agreement is described as a funeral death note. It's a complete unraveling of influence. I want to pivot now to how this strike was actually executed from a strategic standpoint. The China Observer video leans heavily into the idea of strategic deception. They claim that President Trump used a supercomputer-calculated optimal solution to execute this strike. And they use a specific term here, path dependency. This is a concept we should clearly define for the listener, as it is central to the video's thesis.
Path dependency, in this strategic context, is a psychological trap. Think of it like a well-worn hiking trail. If someone always takes the same slow, hesitant path every single day, you eventually stop expecting them to suddenly sprint through the bushes. You build your defenses around the assumption of their hesitation.
Right, you get comfortable.
It's exactly. For months prior to this strike, the video argues that Trump intentionally walked that slow path. He made harsh statements about Iran, but held off on taking any kinetic action. He appeared to dither on other global issues, like Ukraine. This created a behavioral model, a path that China, Russia, and Iran began to rely on deeply. They convinced themselves that he simply wouldn't act decisively.
The transcript says they even started mocking him, leaning right into that false sense of security. But that hesitation was the trap. Just when Beijing and Tehran were entirely comfortable, Trump sprang what the video calls the Z-clan scenario, the most unlikely, unpredicted scenario on their boards. And the detail that really illustrates this trap springing shut is the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford. This is a nuclear-powered supercarrier. It's essentially a floating city and one of the most powerful warships on Earth. But the source points out it didn't do what you'd expect. It didn't make a loud, threatening show of force. What exactly did it do, and why does the video argue this was so psychologically terrifying?
It vanished. Or rather, it vanished from open-source tracking systems. It entered complete radio silence combat mode. The source notes that this silent deterrent was far more terrifying than any shouted threat. When a supercarrier goes silent, it implies immediate kinetic action is imminent, rather than just political posturing.
It's the silent treatment on a geopolitical scale.
Yes, it's the suffocating nature of the tactical execution that the video highlights. While the carrier went silent, the US and Pakistani drones monitored the interior of Iran from the east, keeping a watchful eye on every movement. Simultaneously, the Israeli stealth aircraft struck directly from the west. The video describes this as squeezing Iran from both sides, turning the entire nation into a live target, all while perfectly avoiding any harm to the US bases scattered around Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. It was a masterclass in exploiting the very assumptions Beijing and Tehran had relied upon.
Okay, so we have unpacked the useless technology, the economic panic from severed oil lines, and the masterclass in strategic outmaneuvering. But the China Observer transcript argues that the deepest, most profound impact of this event isn't military or economic, it is actually social. It's about the narrative inside China. To illustrate this, the source points out the incredible contrast between state propaganda and the harsh reality. They bring up Professor Li. She's a well-known strategist from a Chinese defense university. The video highlights a television appearance she made where she boasted that if the U.S. dared to strike Iran, Iran would erase Israel from the map in half an hour, and that would be the day China recovers Taiwan.
The video violently juxtaposes that extreme bravado with the surreal reality of what actually happened. Iran couldn't even protect its own airspace, let alone erase a neighboring country. And the narrative asks, how did entities aligned with China actually respond when their ally was hit? Did they rush to help?
I'm guessing no.
The source shares a highly specific, striking detail. On a Chinese booking website, a one-way commercial flight from Damascus, Syria to Beijing suddenly skyrocketed in price to 3.4 million RMB.
That is roughly $470,000 US dollars for a single plane ticket. Almost $500,000 just to flee.
Exactly. The transcript sarcastically calls this China's rock-solid friendship. Instead of providing wartime aid, smuggling radar components, or offering logistical support, entities were simply trying to make a fortune off the panic of those trying to escape.
Profiting off the fear.
Yeah, the video argues this exposes a deeply transactional, almost cynical nature to the alliance. But the source builds to an emotional climax regarding the social fallout. The propaganda machine in Beijing, according to the video, was entirely prepared to spin this using a decades-old script. They were ready to frame this as American imperialist aggression, shouting about how the invaders would drown in the vast sea of the Iranian People's War.
That concept of the People's War is so foundational to their military doctrine. The idea that the general populace will just naturally rise up in furious unity to defend the regime against outsiders. But the reality that unfolded on social media left those mouthpieces completely speechless. The transcript highlights that Trump skipped traditional diplomatic formalities entirely. Instead, he issued a direct ultimatum and a call for liberation directly to the ordinary people of Iran, telling them to take back their government. And the response, as depicted in the video, completely subverted the propaganda. When the news broke that Khamenei's body had been found, the footage that flooded social networks wasn't of angry militias organizing to fight the West. What did the video claim was actually happening on the ground?
It was footage of Iranian high school students cheering on rooftops. The video paints this incredible scene. Ordinary citizens flooding the streets, singing and dancing, completely unable to control their joy over the fall of the dictator's family. Exiled Iranians in Berlin were shouting praises. The exiled Crown Prince, Reza Pahlavi, raised his fist and announced his return to help build a free country. And this is where we need to pause, because this is the ultimate mirror the source holds up to Beijing. It is the core thesis of the China Observer video.
Let's slow down on that for a second, because that is a staggering proposition to put forward. The idea that a population wouldn't just accept a foreign strike, but actively celebrate it.
Precisely. The video argues that Beijing's ultimate fear isn't just the stealth bombers or the electronic jamming aircraft. It is what the source calls the virus of rebellion. It is the stark realization that military hardware, no matter how advanced or expensive, cannot force a populace to genuinely support a regime. The video argues that watching the ordinary people of Iran cheering at the destruction of their own leadership forces the leadership in Beijing to look at their own situation and silently ask themselves a terrifying question.
Right.
If one day precision-guided weapons were to bypass their own defenses and land behind their red walls, would the people of China fight back, or would they cheer too?
That is a heavy, profoundly unsettling concept for any leadership to grapple with. So to bring all these complex threads together for you, the listener, we've looked at a single source today that paints a picture of a cascading disaster for Beijing stemming from this one night in Tehran. We've explored the claims that their heavily marketed billion-dollar defense technology was proven useless in live combat, shattering their illusion of security. We've seen how their diplomatic alliances in the Middle East supposedly crumbled due to Iranian incompetence, forcing Arab nations toward U.S. defense grids. We've discussed the looming severe energy crisis as their cheap oil lifelines from Venezuela and Iran are severed, threatening their manufacturing core. And finally, we've examined the social terror inspired by a populace cheering for the fall of their own leaders.
And as we look at the what are the likely next trends question, the video transcript brings in the perspective of senior scholar Victor Davis Hansen. He points out that all of these seemingly disparate moves in the Middle East and Eastern Europe serve a singular overarching strategic purpose. The framework laid out suggests the goal is to fundamentally weaken China's global power and, critically, to isolate Russia from China. The source concludes that as these economic lifelines are cut and the technological cover-ups are exposed to the world, the focus inevitably shifts directly to Beijing, leaving those who once boasted of quick victories facing nothing but fear and isolation.
It is a massive, complex web of cause and effect. And that leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over. It's something that builds right out of the source material's claims about isolating Russia. We know that the ultimate strategic goal, according to the video, is to drive a wedge between Moscow and Beijing. Well, consider this. The Russian military is actively engaged in its own conflicts, and they have just witnessed Beijing's supposedly impenetrable billion-dollar defense networks completely fail to protect both Maduro in Venezuela and Khamenei in Iran, all within the span of a single month. If you are sitting in the Kremlin managing a war economy, how long will it be before you look at the data and realize that relying on Chinese military technology might be the very thing that guarantees your own defeat?
It's a profound strategic dilemma. It suggests that the geopolitical landscape will be shaped not just by who has the most weapons, but by who actually trusts the weapons they have.
We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope we've given you a clear, comprehensive look at the arguments, the mechanics, and the narrative surrounding this global event. Keep digging into your sources, keep examining the cause and effect, and most importantly, keep questioning the narratives behind the news. Until next time.